Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're probably wondering why an ageing, I've got one here, so I've got two now, there you go. Ageing telco executive is now running what was Australia's oldest manufacturing company, and that is Hills, or in those days called Hills Industries, Hills Holdings, and now Hills Limited. We started out nearly 70 years ago, 1945, making rotary clotheslines in literally a garage in the back of South Australia. And the story goes like this. Lance Hill, who's up there on the far left-hand side, is on the tram going to work, and his wife had said that she was sick of the string and the pole holding up the clothesline because kids run and knock it from underneath, and she needed a better way of drying her clothes. He got on the tram, had this epiphany and said, I'm going to go and make these new clotheslines. And we like to call it the first solar-powered device because, and frankly, what's really interesting about it is that there's a resurgence in people using, quite interestingly, the sun to dry their clothes other than a dryer, which accounts for about 30% of your power bill. So Lance started this in 1945. The company listed in the 1950s and then went on and became very successful. And in fact, ended up with a market cap of about $1.6 billion. So quite a large Australian company. Today it would be almost in the ASX 100. We're in the ASX 300 today because something happened which was a problem. And that is that as we grew in wealth, we went and bought other businesses. But we didn't buy just one, we bought 28 different businesses across three divisions. So we had plumbing businesses, we had steel businesses, we made playground equipment, we produced water tanks, all sorts of things, and then we got into a little bit in electronics and communications. The problem being is we stopped making things. We started buying things and holding them. It was a bit like Noah's Ark, but only taking one of everything, because we didn't buy a second one in that new industry that we went into and grew it to be a world champion. We just thought that there was strength in the diversity of what we did. So we ended up with, a few years ago when I joined this business, it was in need of restructure. Debt was very, very high. We had too many businesses. We'd integrated nothing. And we kind of lost our way. And I like to say we lost our design mojo somewhere along the way. Now, where the company that the research says has no advantage at all, we're in manufacturing, or we were in manufacturing. My view is to say that I don't believe there's any country in the world that you can say the corollary of, which is they have a comparative advantage in manufacturing, because actually manufacturing underpins all of those other growth categories. You can't be in oil and gas without pipes. You can't be in oil and gas without control mechanisms, valves, industrial equipment. You can't be in mining without all of that. And where do you think the new generation of automatically controlled mining trucks and diggers are coming from? They're coming from a complex blend of hard equipment, electronics and software, and robotics and a whole range of other things. So I think to say Australia has no advantage in manufacturing is a cop-out. Absolute cop-out. Cop-out for the Australian industry, cop-out for the Australian government, and it makes us feel good because we think that we're just entitled to keep digging things out of the ground and actually delivering it and growing wealth. We wouldn't be sitting here in a very nice museum of contemporary art. We wouldn't be sitting with the lifestyle we had without digging it out of the ground, but we've taken it for granted. And if we don't pull our finger out and start making things again, we are in deep trouble. That's our challenge in our side, our business. A lot of fun swinging on the Hills hoist. Great stuff. Unfortunately, when I showed this to the original founder, he says, I hate that photo because of the number of returns we had of people bending it because the whole family would hang on one side. And so he said this was a service problem, and even though it's become this great iconic image, it actually led to a lot of product returns, actually. This is our journey. This is our journey. We started out making clotheslines, but then something wonderful happened. TV was invented in the 1950s, and someone had to make television aerials, and we were already bending metal, so we just bent them into a different shape, and we started getting into making television antennas. Then we got into a little bit more sophistication. We started making broadcast and small satellite equipment. Then we started because we went through a change in society where you couldn't leave your doors unlocked. We went into the alarm business. And in the latest iteration of the company, we've got into networking, digital media, and in health. And in fact, the last 3 businesses we've bought over the last 12 months, as we've narrowed down the focus to the new business of the company, which is largely around the electronics and communication space, are in healthcare. And in each case, we actually make those products in Australia, which is interesting. We've come the full circle now. And in my opinion, the sort of things we've been talking about this week around design are inextricably linked, because it is easier to be conservative rather than to create new businesses. It is easier to cut rather than to create. It is easier to say, oh, we should simply buy this in and not build it. And it is easier to fumble along with our corporate strategies and to fumble along with the sort of government policy we have today than to build the next generation of industrial society, which we need in this country if we are to maintain our standard of living. One of the biggest problems I have is over here. If I do those slides for myself, I agree that strategically they're the industries, but the comparative advantage we have in Australia, what are we really good at? Regulation. Fantastic at it. First class. We should export it. In fact, take it all, right? Take it all and move it off to some other place. We're actually excellent in corporate governance. Well, at least in corporate governance conferences. We're best practice in corporate governance. We're best practice in regulation. And the new government, whilst suggesting that they're going to reinvest in infrastructure and new policy, what are they best practice at? I think a last count would have been over 100 separate reviews and studies which have been commissioned, which are all due to deliver something out in the future. Now, if it's in truth that parties in opposition spend their time thinking about things, why do they have to then spend another couple of years once they get into government thinking about what they're going to do? I don't get it. And why do they appoint the same people to those committees that were appointed by the last government? I don't get that either. So what the problem I find in Australia is that we've lost our way. We're not mongrel enough. We've got to do something more, and we're in a position that if I don't do that with our company, we will not succeed. Where are we going to take our business? Well, if I sat down and I said and looked at the slides, I'd say, I can't make anything because I have no comparative advantage in it. I just think that's nonsense. The competitors that we compete against in our market segments in delivering solutions into security solutions now, healthcare solutions, AV solutions, communication solutions, are not China and India or others that are using an advantage with labour arbitrage. They're actually countries which have similar standards of living and cost of labour that we do, which is Italy, Germany, the US. And in fact, what's going to drive the resurgence in the US economy will not be services, it will be manufacturing. It has been for a very long time. The difference with the US is they don't have the sort of crazy legislation we have around taxation of options and incentives for developers. They don't have the degree of regulation that we put up with at the state and federal level. And they don't have the same regulation in the labour market that we put up with that disincents the recruitment and hiring of labour and moving it quickly between industries. They're the markets I worry about. There is a resurgence going on in the US economy in manufacturing, and I bet we could actually use the same slide and say they don't have a comparative advantage anyway. That's not true. That is simply not true. Every country, in my opinion, has the advantage to develop a manufacturing capability. We're now getting into health solutions. In Australia, you've seen the announcement of the big government fund around healthcare, but there's pockets in the Australian industry that you wouldn't know it was there. South Australia, for example, is one of the leading players globally in medical and monitoring devices. On the east coast of Australia, more about fundamental medical research. Centre of Australia, more about medical devices. How did that happen? Well, because most of these states, which are dealing with a lot more with remote care, South Australia, Northern Territory, Western Australia, they've had to innovate. They've had to drive out a necessity to embrace things like telehealth, remote monitoring, all of those sorts of things which are necessary for the delivery of healthcare. So we're getting into that business. We're getting into security solutions. The nature of security, from your standard alarm right through to what is required today in a new broadband environment. Probably little known appreciated fact, but 90% of home alarms in Australia will not work with the NBN because they're all analog based and they'll have to be swapped out. So there's a massive opportunity for addressing that issue here, and as other countries roll out fibre to the home or fibre to the node, they're going to have, fibre to the home particularly, they're going to have problems with these sorts of things. So we think that that's a comparative advantage for us. We're getting into interactive education solutions, because education, part of the big push into the STEM disciplines now, requires a whole range of different tools and devices that are required to enhance education and to enhance the educational experience. But at the centre of this, for us, is design thinking. Because if we don't design and innovate, we will die. Our company will die. That's the biggest single issue that I see out there. And the reason that we've started sponsoring the Young Innovators Awards at the Design Awards, we're sponsoring the Australian Information Industry Young IT Innovators Award, is because we need to identify those talents who are in Australia that are coming through the system that can actually come into our business and help us with design thinking. I think governments should embrace design thinking. I think they should spend less time worrying about perfecting regulation and more time looking at ways to free regulation to enable people to think outside the square. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face in Australia at the moment. This cultural. Now, the second thing that leads me on to that is the cultural cringe around failure. In Australia, we are not rewarded for failure. In the US, you try and get venture capital. How many times have you? How long have you worked at it? How many times may have you failed? It's actually a stripe or a badge of honour you put on yourself because you've tried and failed and tried. Failed, and then eventually you've broken through and you've been persistent, you've shown that commitment. Here, no, failure is not there. The next issue around that is corporate failure. Shareholders, there's a lot of nonsense you'll read in the financial press about we've got to look at things in the long-term interests of shareholders. The average institution stays on a listed company's register about 9 months. Tell me how they're looking at the long-term interests of shareholders. The average shareholder wants 100% of net profit after tax delivered in dividends with nothing in reinvestment. Tell me that. How's that looking at long-term interests of shareholders? We have such short-termism driven by the very institutions that we thought were there to create value. And in my opinion, we will find that it will not be the investment institutions that innovate. It will not be governments that innovate. It will be individuals within our society given the right freedom and the right incentives that will actually innovate. And that's where our country needs to go. And we need to be far more aggressive. We have to be far more loud about demanding that government addresses these issues. And if I have to see another government report that says the whole trick to business in Australia and manufacturing is, guys, and here, wait for it, because it's just this epiphany the government's had, you have to be more innovative. My God. Thank you for that. We were all in the dark. We didn't know. I mean, this approach to industry formulation, to think that somehow only a few people sitting in Canberra or in a consulting firm hired by Canberra have the knowledge about what you need to do, is just nonsense again. I think the government has to play a role. Now, recently, you would have seen in the press, the government said, Joe Hockey the other day said, we are not giving out corporate welfare. Now, that's very interesting to me because I would think over the last 20 years, if you count up the billions of dollars we've given to foreign auto companies to continue production in this country, suddenly they announce they're leaving the country. they're leaving on the table another 1.5 billion that was promised out through 2020 and the government had already committed to. So the government says, right, you're not getting that 1.5 now because you're leaving in 2017. So the government takes the 1.5 back and then says, we're going to have to grow Australian industry to fill the gap from the automotive industry. So they give the 1.5 to Australian industry? No, we take that back. And we give 60 here, 50 there. So we were happy to give 1.5 billion over the next 5 years to the auto industry, but we're not happy to take the same 1.5 we'd already promised them and they'd already accepted and give 150 million to 10 Australian companies, right? Or 10 million to 150 Australian companies. We weren't prepared to do that. No, that's corporate welfare. What were we doing before? I don't get it. So it's okay to give large sums of money to foreign corporations to stay here, but it's not okay to give small amounts of money to Australian companies who are going to replace the effect of those industries in the Australian economy. What's wrong with that? And you know what? We're all sitting here letting it happen. We're all sitting here letting the current government go through that process. Now, there are many things this current government will do I'm sure will benefit us. I think there's a lot of argument around the stimulation of the Australian economy and paying our way. I'm with that. But what I don't get is that governments should not say that they're going to reduce this so-called corporate welfare and almost walk away from their obligations to stimulate the training in the STEM sciences, walk away from their obligations to stimulate export incentives, walk away from their obligations to change the tax system, in other words, the soft infrastructure of the country, to stimulate and support young designers, young inventors, so that they're not paying their tax on their options up front as they get involved in startup companies. This is crazy stuff. We've got to wake up to it. I don't think that we're still heading in the right direction in Australia, and we need to do something about it. We're trying to do a little bit about it by starting to stimulate this. Look, I'll be honest, it's not pure altruism. I want our brand to be identified with innovation. I want our brand and our company to be able to attract the right talent. That's why we're doing it. That's why we're involved in these sorts of awards. And I'm pleased to say that the winner this week of the Young Australian Design Award was a game controller that was developed by some young guys in South Australia that enables kids with cerebral palsy to actually enjoy the same benefit and experience of gaming that their counterparts in the community can enjoy. This is just a start. I am sure that device is going to have a multiple kick-on effect for a whole range of other devices in the medical area that we haven't even thought about yet. So we have to stimulate this sort of activity and recognise it in the Australian economy. We've started our own. In the last couple of months, we've established 2 design centres ourselves. One, the Lance Hill Design Centre, which is named after the founder of the company, and one is the D-Shop. What we're doing in these is taking, we've called for submissions from projects from designers and innovators right across the country. They've tendered or submitted their propositions. A number have been selected. They're not only getting the physical space and the equipment from us that they need to be able to do it, to drive investment, to enable investment in their ideas, but they're also getting funding from us to take it forward. And again, my view of this is, if over the next 3 years we support 100 of these things, and only one is successful, then it would have been all worthwhile. Because back in 1945, we only had one product. And we only started with one idea. And we grew a large company out of it. That's the reason we need to go back and reinvent ourselves in this way. That's the game controller there, designed for kids with cerebral palsy, for the tactile sensory experience that other children have. This is the sort of uniqueness that I think is part of innovating. The trick for us, though, is not only to design it here, it's to make it here. Because that's one of the advantages that we have, not sending it offshore or ways to do that. Our future will be in the collaboration you see in these sort of pictures that are of university students from various of the universities in South Australia at our design centre. In the background, We've bought the latest equipment and machinery from 3D printing to the latest in terms of production to enable them to accelerate their development. These are the sort of tools and toys that they need to have. I would like to see these sort of design centres and maker centres in every high school in the country. You want to do something with government funding? Do that. Because kids are far more intuitive at picking these things up than people give them credit for. Put a making section in that. Change the whole... When I grew up as a kid, it was metalwork, woodwork, and other things. You want to get people interested in these things? Put a design centre in every major school, high school in the country. That's a good spend of the money. Perhaps some of the $1.5 billion that we've stuck back in the bank can go to doing that. Collaboration is a really important thing. In South Australia, we're starting to collaborate with all the universities there, and they've come to the aid of the party in terms of giving their support to the development of the Design Centre. Collaboration is going to continue to be an important part of what we do. But equally, it's about companies like ourselves sponsoring these researchers and developers and students at these universities to peel out and start their own companies. So that's one of the things that we are certainly focused on. And I want to talk to you finally about success. When we do have success, I think we've got to celebrate it in a far more vocal way. Success is celebrated when, where do I go to get my energy? Sometimes I go offshore and I go to the west coast of the US, or I go into Berlin, which is now the home of the sort of huge amount of online development. I go to other markets to try and get that energy. We should have that energy here. We should have a mechanism here which rewards, acknowledges, encourages, builds, manufactures in this country. And if we don't get there, and the reason I'm passionate about it, I'm so old now I can say what I like. That's the beauty of growing old, right? I don't care. But my passion is, one thing I'd like to do in my corporate career is take something that's not just distributing a product, right? That's not just doing things for the short term, and actually build it so I can walk away and say, I've left it in a better condition, but now we're producing something here that we didn't produce yesterday. And if everybody had that sort of one attitude over the next couple of years in Australia, I'm sure we'd be able to succeed. You don't become successful unless you encounter failure. We need to embrace it. It's so important. And that's in my organisation. I'm trying to encourage people to ask for forgiveness rather than for permission, because they've got to be able to exercise their discretion and make some failures along the way. And finally, our country's got to be about ideas, but not just about the service industries. It's got to be about ideas that manufacture. And the reason I believe that is this: manufacturing, the multiplier effect in the economy of a manufacturing enterprise is 7 times what you'd get out of tourism or these other things where we have this so-called relative advantage. The biggest manufacturer in the world, in fact, if you go back in history, was Great Britain, right? Through the Industrial Revolution. That's how they grew wealth. That's how they extended it. We've got to get back to it here. We've got to stop saying that we have no comparative advantage in that, and we've got to build it, because we need to be able to export, we need to be able to stimulate and provide the opportunity for the graduates coming through the system, and we need to be able to look ourselves in the eye in 10, 20, 30 years' time and say something different than we were best practice in taxation, and we were best practice in regulation, and we're outstanding practice in atrophy. I think one of the things we've got here is, let's acknowledge where we are today. I'm not bagging the country. I'm bagging the starting point. The starting point is not in digging things out of the ground. The starting point is in people who come up with ideas that actually manufacture the product and they take them to market. And we've got to encourage that. Thank you very much.
Ted, don't go anywhere. We're going to take a few minutes. Meredith, can I invite you to come back up on stage?